Well, thanks, Anthony, and warm welcome to you all. The story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood is one of the most famous from the Bible. At the time, God looked upon his creation and saw that the wickedness of man was very great. Every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. And he regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. In Genesis 6 and verse 7, the ESV records, "So God said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." But there was a man, Noah, who in Genesis 6 and verse 9 is described as being a just man and perfect in his generation. And it's recorded of Noah that he walked with God. Noah found grace in the eyes of God, and Noah was given plans to build an ark, a great big boat, a great big floating wooden box, if you like, which was to be used to the saving of his house. 157 metres long, 22 metres wide and 13 metres high. It was to be made of gopher wood. The exact identity of gopher wood is still questioned even today, and it's possible that gopher refers to a process or method used to prepare the wood, as in gophering the wood. The words gopher wood are translated in the Septuagint as squared beams, and the Vulgate translates the same words as planed wood. Planed as in shaping it to be flat-sided and level. And some researchers have suggested that gopher refers to a lamination process, which would have advantages considering the size of the ark. So in other words, if true, the correct translation would be laminated wood. Noah was instructed to make the ark of laminated wood. There was to be lower, second and third stories. There was to be a door set on the side, a skylight, pitched within and without with pitch. And finally, it's finished. And then he waits. A huge boat, dry docked. Nothing happens. Was it all a mistake? And you can imagine the jokes. What kind of lights does Noah have on his boat? Floodlights. Need to build an ark? I know a man. They lived for 7, 8, 900 years, so there were plenty of dad jokes available. And you can also imagine the headlines. A great interest when it was first completed, no doubt, which then dwindled as it appeared Noah had made a strategic mistake. 2 Peter 2 and verse 5 records for us, reading from the ESV, God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. How was Noah a herald of righteousness? Well, it was through the example of his lifetime commitment to building an ark which finally stood completed and ready in demonstration of an absolute trust in his God for the moment when finally God says, Noah, you've got 7 days, get on the ark. What I told you 120 years ago is now all going to happen. It's on. And so together with Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, their wives, and representatives of every kind of land animal, they entered into that ark. We're told that the door was shut fast by God, and it started to rain, and continued to rain for 40 days and for 40 nights. The waters rose and engulfed the earth. Everything that had breath was drowned. Everything, that is, with the exception of Noah and his family, and the animals that they had taken aboard. They were all kept alive in the ark which he had prepared thoroughly, in reverent regard of God's command, to the saving of his house. And they resided in that ark for an entire year, and finally embarked out of the ark to what was a very different world to the one that they had left. The story of Noah is one of obedience and trust. You know, when he was first told to build an ark, he didn't even have children. He was 500 years old when he begat Shem, Ham and Japheth. We're told that in Genesis 5 and verse 30. He was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth in Genesis 7 and verse 11. So for the first 20 years of building an ark to the saving of his household, he didn't even have children. That's a remarkable display of obedience, faith and trust in his God. And so on one side of the ledger, the water destroyed all whose nostrils in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Of all that was in the dry land, died. But on the other side of the ledger, the ark and the water saved Noah and his family. Come across to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20. We have these words recorded of Noah. It says, "When once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a-preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water." How were these 8 souls saved? Well, yes, no doubt, the ark played a key role in that. But it tells us here in 1 Peter that they were saved by water. And if we come back to the record in Genesis 7, we see indeed that Noah and his family and the animals on board were saved by water. Come back to Genesis 7, we see that in verse 17, the flood was 40 days upon the earth. So it rained 40 days upon the earth. And not surprisingly, it says, the waters increased, they bear up the ark, and it was lifted above the earth. So we've got the picture, haven't we, of waters rising, and eventually the ark, there's a bit of a wobble, and it starts to float. And it's lifted up above the earth. In verse 18, the waters prevailed. They increased. So they're supporting, they're lifting up that ark. In verse 19, the waters continue to prevail. In verse 20, the waters prevail. Verse 24, the waters prevailed. We come across to chapter 8 and verse 3. And now we read that the waters returned. In verse 3 at the end, the waters were abated. The waters were dried up from off the earth. In verse 7, the waters were dried up from off the earth. In verse 14, the earth was dry. And then Noah went forth. So you see, it's exactly as the Apostle Peter recorded. Noah and his household and those animals aboard the ark were saved by water. And Noah's flood is a reference to a year-long global catastrophe that destroyed the pre-flood world some 4,300 years ago. Now, in the scheme of anything, 4,300 years is a long time. So you might ask, how could the story of Noah's flood have any relevance of us today? How is it possibly a warning for today? And that's what we hope to answer tonight. Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And history gives an opportunity to learn from past mistakes, and the Bible has a very important warning and a specific message for all of us concerning the days of Noah. And here is the warning. Matthew 24 or Luke 17. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Son of Man here is a title for Jesus. And in the context of both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is talking to his disciples about his return to the earth. He's actually responding to a question from his disciples who had asked him earlier what would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. And he gives this stark warning and a stark message of encouragement to his disciples as to what society will be like when he returns. And did you notice, as we read, the repetition of thought? As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. As in those days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. They were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. No fewer than 3 times, the same message, the same warning is repeated. And I guess it's really impossible to miss Jesus' point. Just like the days of Noah were, so shall the days be in the coming of the Son of Man. It will be the same at the coming of the Son of Man. So that means, key to understanding the relevance of the warning from Noah's flood for our society today is to determine if the description of society before the flood is a description that is similar for our own society. As God looked down upon the earth in Genesis 6 and verse 5 and saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that the imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, would he make the same observation of our society today? That's the question, isn't it? And we're going to see, yes, there are remarkable similarities. And so, as Jesus has warned, the logical conclusion is that his return is imminent. There are remarkable similarities and parallels that exist between the two societies. We are living in days like Noah found himself living in prior to the flood. Christ is nearly here. Everywhere the signs abound, and it won't be long before he comes. Believe it or not, he is coming, ready or not. So what we're going to do now is to spend some time looking at, firstly, the build-up to Genesis chapter 6. There's 2 opposed ways of life straight out of Genesis 3. The seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And the seed of the serpent are detailed in the story of Cain in Genesis chapter 4 and verses 16 to 24. The seed of the woman is detailed in Genesis chapter 4 verse 25 and through to the end of Genesis chapter 5. And when we go through those 2 lines of descendants, we'll notice that there are 2 key differences in their descriptions. The descendants of Cain were dedicated to achievements of industry, personal accomplishment, society, civilization, city creation, sophistication, ingenuity, entertainment, everything associated with man. And when we look at the descendants of Seth, you might say it's a little bit boring. What do they dedicate themselves to? Well, the begetting of sons and daughters. And in direct comparison of Cain's generation, where it talks about their prowess and their accomplishments, building cities, making a name, the descendants of Seth are dedicated to having sons and daughters and raising a godly seed. It's actually quite a useful exercise to go through chapter 6 and to colour in chapter 5 and to colour in the expression begat sons and daughters. All the way through chapter 5 you will see the seed of the woman does nothing else than to beget sons and daughters. Whereas, as we've said, the seed of Cain is focused on grandeur and permanence and making names for themselves. Well, let's have a closer look at Cain's genealogy. Early in chapter 4, Cain had murdered his brother, and Abel's dead. And God said to Cain, "You're banished." So Cain went out from the presence of God and he dwelt in the land of Nod, the land of exile to the east of Eden. But he didn't stay a wandering nomad for too long. No, that wasn't going to be Cain. And in Genesis 4 and verse 17 we read, "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And when he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch." So he built the first city known in the Bible, and he named that city after his son Enoch, which means dedicated. He dedicated the first city, and no doubt continued building cities. He was going to have a place of permanency in the defiance of the curse back in verse 12, when God said he was to be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And then in Genesis 4 and verse 18, we are first introduced to a man by the name of Lamech. And unto Enoch, it says, was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, Mehujael begat Methusiel, and Methusiel begat Lamech. Lamech means powerful, the strong man. He had an enormous influence on society, as we see in verses 19 to 24, where the Bible deliberately brings more details into focus about him. And he's introduced to us as the man who introduced polygamy, the marrying of more than one wife. He becomes known as the father of children who have economic achievement, entertainment and warfare as their signature tune. In verse 23 we see he's a man of hard and arrogant speeches. Jude tells us he is ungodly, is a loud-mouthed boaster, and shows favouritism to gain advantage. He's a proud and arrogant and violent man. He's the epitome of the seed of the serpent, a mode of thinking and behaviour which is diametrically opposed to God and which God hated. Lamech was the father of the modern world. Often when you go through genealogies in the Bible, the wives' names aren't given, but they feature here as the wives of Lamech. We've got there that he took two wives in verse 19, and the first one was known as Adar. That name means ornament or decorated one, and it probably leaves very little to the imagination to imagine why Lamech took Adar to be his wife. We're told that she bare two sons. Jabal, in verse 20, made farming into a business. He was the economic entrepreneur of buying and selling. It's all about economic growth. He was the financial advisor, increasing the quantity and the quality of the economic goods and services that his society produced. He became the hub of economic development. In verse 21, his brother Jubal, we're told, was the father of music and melody. He's the chap that created music into an art form. Jubal was the artistic director of entertainment. He became the hub of entertainment. His other wife, Zillah, in verse 22, we're told that she bare Tubal-Cain. Zillah actually means shade and has the idea of shadow or protection, defence. And it's interesting, she bore Tubal-Cain, and what's he known as? Well, he's the son that goes down in history as the instructor, the warrior of weaponry who held the tools and showed people how to make the weapons of war. She also bare a daughter, and it's unusual to be told this, called Naamah, which actually means loveliness. And there's possibly a connection there with Genesis 6 verse 2, the daughters of men were fair and pleasant to the eyes. So this family had an incredible impact on the world. And the world around Noah rapidly deteriorated until Noah came into the ark. There was also a chip on Lamech's shoulder. He seemed angry about the way that he'd been treated. And we read in Genesis 4 verse 23 to 24 these words. Lamech said to his wives, so he gathers his wives together and he makes a little speech to them. He says, "Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold," and listen to this, "truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold." It's known in history as the Song of the Sword. In the margin, you will see verse 23 where he says, "For I have slain a man," in the margin, got a King James version, "or I would slay a man in my wound." If anyone tried to touch him, he says to his wives, well, listen to this. God dealt with Cain sevenfold back in verse 15, but I, Lamech, will deal with anyone that touches me 70 and sevenfold. In other words, mess with me and you're going to all know about it. It actually appears that someone had bruised and wounded his ego, most likely verbally, and he wanted vengeance. What could that have been? Well, on the family tree, you can see that Lamech was the seventh generation from Adam in the line of Cain, while Enoch was the seventh from Adam in the line of Seth. So Lamech and Enoch were contemporaries. Look at what Jude tells us about what was going on. Come across to Jude. Jude, verse 11. "Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain." And then we come down to verse 14. "And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and convince all that are ungodly among all of their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lusts, and their mouth speaketh great swelling words, having men's persons in admiration because of advantage." As a little exercise, it's worth colouring in the word ungodly in verses 15 and 16, and hard speeches, and the little phrase, "their mouth speaketh great swelling words." Who was Enoch talking about if he wasn't referring to Lamech when he said, "Of all their hard speeches, and their mouth speaketh great swelling words"? The NET has, and he gave bombastic speeches, enchanting folk for their own gain. So it appears that Enoch had prophesied about the ultimate destruction of the wickedness that Lamech's family had brought upon the earth. And Lamech's boast is that he would have a crack at this man Enoch. The sons of men didn't need the protection of God. They were confident in their weapons of defence, and they would withstand God's judgment upon them. They were comfortable with their lives, thank you very much, and if God was going to intervene, then let him have a go. will deal with you, Enoch. Enoch stood up against him. The godless, arrogant lifestyle was going to be wiped off the face of the earth. And Lamech took it personally and sought to murder Enoch for the personal attack that he felt was being levelled against him. In Genesis 5 verse 24, come back there, it tells us that chapter 5 verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Hebrews 11 verse 5, when it's going through that list of the faithful, says about Enoch, by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. Translated means to move from one situation to another. So, what death was it that he should not see? Well, we know from Hebrews 11 that Enoch died in faith. It tells us that about all the faithful. So the death he was translated from was Lamech's vengeful intention of death as he searched out Enoch upon the earth so that he could kill him. But God took Enoch. He translated him so that he couldn't be found or killed by Lamech. And Enoch's faithfulness was starkly contrasted against Lamech's godlessness and arrogance. God saved him so that Lamech couldn't kill him. Interesting thing is that Enoch had a son. And his name in Genesis 5 and verse 21, we're told, was Methuselah. It's actually two words which means the man of the dart. The man, a mature man full of days, and the dart like a missile. It has the idea of speed and intensity. In other words, his name meant in the fullness of days it will thrust through in vengeance. And the year that Methuselah died, the flood came and destroyed the seed of Cain, wiping the earth clean to start again, exactly as prophesied by Enoch, which we read in Jude. Lamech and Enoch stood for those two very different lifestyles. So in chapter 5, Scripture now introduces us to the seed of the woman. In Genesis 5 and verse 1, we're told that in that day that God created man, he created him in the likeness of God. Made in the likeness of God. Those who thought and acted like God. Totally different to the thinking of the seed of Cain. And they focused primarily on the production of the seed of the woman to continue the fight against the thinking of the serpent. That was their entire focus. And you'll see that pattern when you go through that chapter. In Genesis 5 and verse 3, Seth there is described as a son. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. I'm missing it there. Doesn't matter, but it's there somewhere. The point I want to make is that when you go through that list, it actually is an interesting way that it keeps on telling you who was born. It tells us that Seth begat Enos, and then the next descendant, it says that Enos begat Canaan. So what the record is actually doing is actually assigning a name to whoever they begat. That is, until you came down to verse 28, and we read about Lamech. Now, this is not the same Lamech that we've just spoken about. Lamech, it says in verse 28, lived 182 years, and he begat a son. So there's a difference. Instead of actually giving a name to this son, begetting who it was, it tells us that he begat a son. Why was it changed? Why does the scriptural record of this genealogy suddenly refer to this particular boy as a son? Well, he was a special boy, a son who was unique like Seth. He was called Noah, which means rest. Why would you call your boy rest? What was there to need to have a rest from, you might ask? Well, verse 29 gives us the answer. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which Yahweh have cursed." Toil means sorrow. And there's really a very obvious link back to Genesis chapter 3. After Adam and Eve had sinned, God said to them, he said unto Adam in verse 17, he said, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life." So in Genesis 5 and verse 29, we actually have a prophetic statement about what the work of Noah what he was going to perform. And through the work of Noah, the seed of the woman was going to find consolation. The reversal, we're told, of the curse on the ground would come. The seed of the woman were feeling the effects of the sin. It was affecting their ability to eat food, and being ground down day by day in the relentless toil of just bringing food to the table. The thorns and the thistles were a reminder of sin, and Lamech hoped that through this son Noah, God would provide respite, consolation and rest from the distress of sin. He didn't believe that Noah would totally remove the curse. He just wanted a reprieve to maintain a godly seed. Sin was burdening him down. And respite was going to be brought by a preacher of righteousness. He brought the comfort of the scriptures. Amazingly, he also brought respite to the ground. If you come to Genesis 8 and verse 20 to 23, after the flood and Noah's now out on dry ground, it tells us that in verse 20, he built an altar unto Yahweh and offered an offering. And Yahweh, verse 21, the Lord smelled a sweet savour and said in his heart, "I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." So doesn't this mean that thorns and thistles were taken away? Sorry, it doesn't mean that thorns and thistles were taken away in terms of the curse, but what it does mean is that the proliferation of those thorns and thistles was. So, as Lamech had asked for reprieve in the naming of his son, we find that God worked through Noah, rest, and then after the flood, the earth didn't see that same proliferation of thorns and thistles. So it was a little easier. There was a reversal of the curse on the ground as a result of Noah's obedience. Genesis 6 and verse 1. We read here, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them." So, straight away, what we've been told is that in the days of Noah, men began to multiply. There was an explosion of the population on earth. From the creation of Adam and Eve, it was about 1,656 years to the flood. And it varies a little bit in terms of calculating what that population would be, but figures I've seen could be anywhere between 2 and 10 billion people. It's an estimate that takes into account birth rates, long lifespans, and so forth. How does that compare to today? Well, our current world population is 7.94 billion people. It was only 2 billion around 1927. So it indicates, if there was a population of 2 to 10 billion, that they would have required a higher level of technology than what we probably currently give that particular society credit for. They would have required similar technology as we have today in terms of transport, communication, and all those things. I guess the point I'm trying to make, it was not an age of man being primitive. People lived a long time. As we mentioned before, 700, 800, 900 years old. And someone who lives that long brings an enormous amount of experience. You know, we might retire at 65. Well, imagine people 10 times that age. They would have been experts in their field. And imagine the expertise that was in the world through people who lived that long, as they refined and honed in on their pursuits of economic achievement, entertainment, and warfare, as they became men of renown. You might have come across the so-called world population clock. And just as a little interesting aside, this chart illustrates how the world population has changed throughout into our own history. A tremendous change, as you'll see on that chart, occurred with the Industrial Revolution and advances in medicine. And whereas it took until 1800 for the world population to reach 1 billion, the second billion was achieved in 130 years, in 1930, the third billion in 30 years in 1960, the fourth billion in 15 years, 1974, and the fifth billion in only 13 years, that was reached in 1987. So during the 20th century alone, the population in the world has grown from 1.65 billion to 6 billion people. Interesting little statistic, in 1970, there were only roughly half as many people in the world as there is today. So I think we would have to agree there has been an explosion in population, marrying and giving in marriage. Well, the tragedy which we see in Genesis chapter 6 was when these two seeds came together. When they intermingled, the truth was diluted through personal choice, through fleshly desires spiralling out of control to the point where God could no longer work with man, and in desperation and in anger, he wipes them off the face of the earth. He starts again with one man, Noah, who devoted himself to serving and trusting in his God for life. And in Genesis 6, verse 2, we read that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Come back to Genesis 4 and verses 25 to 26. We read here, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. And this is the phrase to take attention to. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. If you look at your margin, the number little 5, then began man to call themselves by the name of the Lord. In other words, the genealogy, the generations of Genesis chapter 5, continued on the name of God in their families. Those then listed in Genesis 5 were the sons of God. Why were they sons of God? Because they called themselves by the name of God. And those in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 2 were the sons of God who saw the daughters of men that they were fair. The ESV says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. It's actually an echo back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, when Eve saw that the tree was good for food and that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired to make one wise. She took, it tells us, of the fruit thereof. These daughters of men represented all that the world stood for. These were whom the sons of God married and subsequently left the truth. I wonder if you understand the enormity of the situation. The sons of God looked at the daughters of men, and they took to them of whomsoever they chose. In verse 2 of chapter 6, have a look at the emphasis. And they took them wives of all which they chose. It's worth colouring those words in. Their decision was made on the basis of what they saw and not what they knew. Nothing in common. What was the attraction? These girls were attractive. They looked good. But it gets worse. If you look down further in verse 4, we're told that there were giants in the earth in those days. It's not referring to physical size, but there were bullies, there were tyrants who took to the people to make them think their way. Those who controlled the hubs of economic achievement, entertainment and warfare. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, they bare children to them. Did these children call themselves by the name of God? They bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And in Hebrew, this is the masculine noun meaning name or fame. So instead of taking on God's name and begetting sons and daughters to continue a godly seed, what did these children do? They made a name for themselves. And so slowly but surely, moral standards and all that was right and honourable and true was worn down by personal choice, individual interpretations and emotional feelings. And it got to the point where the truth was on the brink of extinction. And God recognises that in verse 3. Effectively, he's saying, if I leave man, eventually there's not going to be anyone left who's going to show my characteristics. The Bible was no longer the moral compass for man's life, and if God didn't intervene, all that was going to be involved with the truth would be gone. And so in verse 5, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuing. How bad was it? Everything they determined to do had nothing to do with God's way. They could only think evil, it tells us. The thinking of the serpent had expanded so far that almost no one desired to call themselves by the name of God. And so in verse 6, we have God's response. It repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. It tore him up emotionally. Why? Well, in verse 12, God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And we don't have time, but you might just want to note there that that's absolutely an echo back to Genesis 3 verse 25, where the cherubim were placed to guard the way, that is God's way, to the tree of life. Of the billions on the planet, in the end, only 8 people were saved. And God started, as it were, again with them. In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 1, the same commandment was given to Noah and his household as he originally gave to Adam and to Eve. God says to Noah and his household, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. In other words, Noah and your family, a new start. What do I want you to do? Go and beget sons and daughters and raise them up to call themselves by the name of God. But sadly, Noah and his family still had that bias towards sin. And we're not going into it, but you read the record, you'll see that problems arose in his own family. And for the astute, the same problem 200 years later in Genesis 11 and verse 1 to 5 is seen. If you just quickly go over the page, in Genesis 11 is the record of the Tower of Babel. And what's the problem? Well, verse 3, you've got them saying, "Let us make bricks and burn them." In verse 4, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven." And here's the crux, "Let us make us a name." And so God intervened to slow down the progress. There was the confounding of languages, so there was nations were created, the age was reduced, and the brakes were put on. But what that demonstrates is that although God did start with Noah, the problem of sin was still there, and we see it rear its head again in history. So many sons of God, labelled the faithful, have been born and have died down through the ages. And they will be raised from the dead at Jesus' return. In Hebrews 11, speaking of the faithful, including Noah in that list, it says, "And these all, having received a good report through faith, received not the promise. God, having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." So individually we must work out our own salvation with fear and trembling, for it's God which worketh in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. The Bible in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 opens up with these words. It says, "In the beginning, in the first place, God created the heaven and the earth." We don't know how long ago this was because it seems that verse 1 is referring to the time before the creation record. A time in verse 2 when the earth was without form, that is, it was without structure, and it was void, it was empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And this is a lead into verse 3 of Genesis 1, the start of creation 6,000 years ago. And during the first group of 3 days, God creates a structure, and then during the second group of 3 days, he inhabits that structure. So at the end of the 6 days, the earth was no longer without form and it's no longer empty. Everything was made, and it's described as being very good. But why did he do that? Why did God set about to do this? So perhaps in your head, you're already reciting the words of Numbers 14, verse 21, where God swore by his very existence. He said, "As truly as I live, all the earth is going to be filled with my glory." The grand purpose of God has always been to expand his glory through people who willingly become like him. He purposes to develop and thereby add more members to his family from his creation, a family which all have the same character as himself. I'll say that again. To develop and thereby add more members to his family which have the same characteristics as himself. Here again is the warning of Jesus. In Noah's day, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage. There's nothing new in that. There's probably nothing wrong in that as such. Men have been doing that since Adam and Eve. After all, didn't God tell them? Haven't we read that God also said to Noah to go and subdue and replenish the earth? So why is it such a significant pointer of society at the time of Jesus' return? Well, obviously because it will be a society just like society in Noah's day, a society that's going about its own life, the marrying of the sons of God with the daughters of men. The results, children, determined to make a name for themselves. Bullies or tyrants making the people think their way. Those controlling the hubs of economic achievement, entertainment and warfare. A society where the sons of God are becoming a rare find and in fact in danger of being wiped out altogether. Does it sound familiar? The parallels between society in Noah's day and the society of our day are remarkably similar. But we've seen that God has sworn by his existence that the earth will be filled with his glory. The sons of men will never get the better of him. God purposes to develop and thereby add more members to his family from this creation. A family which all have the same character as himself. And he wants each of us here in this hall and those listening online, everyone, to be a part of that family. Let's just come across to 1 Peter chapter 3. We did allude to one of the verses from 1 Peter 3, but we'll just read that little section now from verse 20 to 22 as we start to conclude and to wrap up our thoughts. It says in verse 20, "When once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water, the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is gone into heaven and is on the right hand of God." So Jesus is now at the right hand of God. As Noah and his household were saved by water, Peter tells us, so we also can be saved through baptism and the answer of a good conscience. It was Jesus that commanded his disciples. He said, "Go out into all the world and preach the gospel. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned." And when Jesus returns, he will do so to judge this world in righteousness. Acts 17 verse 31, "God commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead." So our Lord will return. He will judge this world in righteousness, and we have been given clear indications of what society will be like when he does return. And finally, at the end of the 1,000 years of his reign, God will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek, the descendants of Cain, from under heaven. Let's just turn up. Some of us looked at this morning, but Revelation chapter 21 and verses 1 to 5, describing that period after the end of the millennium. John says, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea, there was no more nations. I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. Look at this. He, that is God, will dwell with them. They shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And the result, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, sorrow, crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new." That is a wonderful picture of the age to come and what the descendants of Seth, the sons of God, can look forward to. So the question really that we need to then leave with tonight, that we need to really answer for ourselves is, which genealogy do I fit in? There's really only two options, isn't there? The seed of Cain The seed of the serpent, whose empire building, power and focus on self. Someone who is willingly ignorant and unaware until that guaranteed destruction came. Or the seed of the woman, whose focus was entirely on developing a godly seed to maintain the fight for the truth and to be added to the heavenly family of God, all having that same beautiful character as his. Two options. Which genealogy do we fit in? What is the litmus test to answering this question? Well, the answer to that is to ask a question. What is it that we are building? What are we focusing all our time on? What are we dedicating our lives to? Be honest, is it power, prestige, esteem, economic grandeur, building our businesses, entertainment, making ourselves a name, reading and consuming the latest self-help books, studying and consuming all we can about the world's successful businesses and business philosophies? For what? What are we doing? Or are we focusing on the family of the faithful, working with each other and our children to build and continue the family of the faithful, to ensure that the truth remains and that we will be ready when Jesus returns and says, "What I have told you is about to happen. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord." Will we then heed the warning of Noah's flood? We make the answer now. Even so come, Lord Jesus.